afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. 안녕하십니까. My pleasure to be here this afternoon. The First Nations culture is something that I've been interested in. Another good friend of mine, Nam Soon Hee Senseng Nim from Sun Chan, was one of my partners for the UNESCO Cross-Culture Awareness Program, which is a cultural program being presented in Jeollanam-do and throughout Korea for foreigners to discuss their culture with schools and students all throughout Korea. And one of the parts of my Canadian presentation culture is about the First Nations people. It's very important. And I thought it would be interesting for some of the GIC members to have the opportunity to listen to that. So, in fact, I mentioned in the Gwangju News summary that this is a topic that has some connection to Korean peoples. And do you know why? How about you smart students in the front? Do you know why the First Nations people are connected to the Korean people? No? Okay. In Korea, many young babies have a spot on their backside. What do you call that? Right. Well, the First Nations people in Canada also, some of the population have this Mongolian birth spot because you guys all came from the same general area in Mongolia about 20,000 or 25,000 years ago. And during that time, there was a huge ice sheet that was covering North America as well as northern parts of Asia. And as a result of that huge amount of ice, the seawater dropped, and there was a land bridge from Asia into North America. So about 25,000 years ago, we saw the first Mongolian Asians coming into North America and starting to explore the new lands of North America and Canada. Right. And as the ice began to recede, to melt, then the native peoples started to move to more and more areas, east and south, in Canada and North America. Originally, I was going to discuss about all of North America, but the topic is too huge, and there's too much information for that. Plus, the original populations coming from Asia in the northern parts in Canada were not influenced by the South American populations where they started to mix in Central America and southern United States, coming from the southern areas of South America. This is a quote from the Dene Nations. It says, "For thousands of years, we have shared a way of life, but we are many different nations living side by side. Our stories teach that we must care for the resources of the land and the sea, the cedar and the salmon." So, I think an interesting part of First Nations culture is what we talk about, the creation myth. What's the creation myth of the Bible? Can someone summarize that for me? Before that. Before Adam.
6 days of creation.
That's right. 6 days of creation, and then on the seventh day, God was Beksu. Took a rest. Right? Do we know the Bible creation story? That's kind of what I'm comparing it to. So, on the first day, there was night and day. The second day, there was water and sky. The third day, there was land and water and some animals. Like that. Okay? So, one of the important parts about First Nations culture is it's an oral culture, an oral tradition. Meaning that the stories were told by the grandfathers and the grandmothers to the next generation. Nobody wrote anything down. So as a result, the stories can be changing a little bit, because maybe your hearing of my story is a little bit different than his hearing of the story. So you're going to tell your grandchildren differently than you will. Okay? But I'm going to give you a few examples of some of the popular creation myth stories that we have in Canada and North American culture. First is the Dene, I believe. Just a moment. So this is going to be very similar to how the Dene people would be talking about their creation. The first people of the earth had to endure winter for the entire 12 months of the year. Most of the land was covered by massive moving layers of ice and deep snow. No trees and bushes or flowers could survive in the harsh, ripping cold. The lakes and rivers were frozen, so no water flowed. It was a land of endless cold. One day, when the first people were out hunting, they came upon a bear who had a sack around its neck, a bag. The hunters were very curious, and they asked the bear what was in the sack. The bear growled a deep reply that he had a sack filled with the abundance of summer's warmth and light. The hunters wanted the sack and offered to trade, but the bear would not part with his sack. The hunters begged the bear, but still he refused to give up the sack. When they saw that it was useless to argue any longer, they decided to return to their people and think of some way to take away the coveted sack. The chief being, who's the chief in First Nations culture? Chief. In English. Who's the chief? Chief. He's the boss, the president. Yeah. Right? Okay, of their peoples. The chief heard the entire story and called his people together to arrive at a plan at how they could take the sack away from the bear. They decided to lure the bear to a great feast, fill him with food, and when he slept, steal the sack. A tempting feast of moose and caribou was prepared. The hunters searched for the bear and located him. They asked the bear to attend the feast in his honor, and the bear readily accepted. The bear arrived in the evening, but he did not have his sack around his neck. Although disappointed, the people served the feast anyways. The bear ate his fill and fell asleep. The chief was frustrated and still wanted the sack. He ordered 4 of the villagers' skilled hunters to follow the bear home and steal the sack by any means they could. The next morning, the bear awoke and bid the chief and his people farewell. The 4 hunters followed closely behind the bear for about an hour when they came upon a large cave. Peering inside, they spotted the sack laying on the cave floor, with 2 black bears guarding it. The hunters were very curious and courageous, and they sprang into the cave to demand the sack. A fierce fight killed 3 of the hunters and mortally wounded the 4th. But before he died, he grabbed the sack and unleashed the abundance of warmth and light. Instantly, the air became warm and the sky filled with bright sunlight. The snow melted into rivers and lakes. The hills and the valleys were covered with trees, flowers, and bushes. Strange birds flew in great numbers and built nests and streams filled with fish. Every year since that time, summer has come to the Dene. Okay, so there's our first story. The Dene are people who live on the western part of Canada, on the western coast of Canada. Next is the story about Earth Mother and the Turtle Island. If you saw in our first picture, we could see a medicine man or a shaman And can we go back to the first slide, please? And as you can see here, that in some ways, I think the shaman culture, the First Nations culture, is a little bit similar to the Korean shaman culture. All right? The shamans are considering that the rocks have a spirit, the trees have a spirit, the earth has a spirit. Well, it's the same in our First Nations culture. They strongly believe about each of the animals has a different power or spirit that guards parts of the land and guides some of the actions of the land. And one of the interesting stories I had was when I was working in the forests in Canada as a forest firefighter for my university years. I worked with many of the First Nations people in Canada. And one of them came to me and said, "Have you ever heard the story about our creation?" And I said, "No, I have no idea." And he went on to tell me the story about Turtle Island. So, I wore my Turtle Island shirt today. And we'll listen to the story. In the beginning, there was no world, no land, no creatures of the kind that are around us now, and there was no men. But there was a great ocean which occupied the space as far as anyone could see. Above the ocean was a great void of air. There was nothing in the air. And in the air lived the birds of the sea. In the ocean lived the fish and the creatures of the deep. Far above this unpeopled world, there was sky world. Here lived gods who were like people like the Iroquois. And the Iroquois is one of the central nations of Canada. In the sky world, there was a man who had a wife. And the wife was expecting a child. The woman became hungry for all kinds of strange delicacies, as women tend to do when they are pregnant. She kept her husband busy, almost to distraction, finding delicious things for her to eat. In the middle of the sky world, there was a great tree, which was not like any of the trees we know. It was tremendous and huge. It had grown there forever. It had enormous roots that spread out from the floor of the sky world. The tree was not supposed to be marked or mutilated by any of the beings who dwelt in the sky world. It was a sacred tree that stood at the center of the universe. The woman decided that she wanted some bark from one of the roots of the great tree, perhaps as food, maybe as medicine, we don't know. She told her husband this. He didn't like the idea. He knew it was wrong. But she insisted, and he gave in. So he dug a hole among the roots of the great sky tree, and he bared some of the roots. But the floor of the sky world wasn't very thick, and he broke a hole through it. He was terrified, for he had never expected to find empty space below the sky world. But his wife was filled with curiosity. He wouldn't get any of the roots for her, so she set out for herself. She bent over and looked down, and she saw the ocean far below. No one knows just what happened next. Some say she slipped. Some say her husband, fed up with her asking for so many things, pushed her. So she fell through the hole. And as she fell, she frantically grabbed at the edges, but her hands slipped. However, between her fingers, there clung bits of things that were growing on the floor of the sky world, and bits of the root tips of the great tree. And so she began to fall towards the great ocean far below. The birds of the sea saw the woman falling, and they immediately consulted with each other as what they could do to help her. Flying wingtip to wingtip, they made a great feathery raft for her in the sky to support her, and thus they broke her fall. The great sea turtle came and agreed to receive her on his back. The birds placed her gently on the shell of the turtle, and now the turtle floated about in the huge ocean with the woman safely on his back. And the woman said to herself that she would die. But the creatures of the sea came to her and said that they would try to help her, and asked her what they could do. She told them that if she could find some soil or some earth, she could plant the roots and the things that were stuck in her fingers. And from them, the plants would grow. The sea animals said perhaps there was dirt at the bottom of the ocean, but no one had ever been down there, so they could not be sure. Finally, the muskrat. Do you know a muskrat? Muskrat? Anyone? It's like a water squirrel, I guess would be the best way to say it. Buldaranji. Right? The muskrat said he would try. He dived and disappeared. All the creatures held their breath, but he did not return. After a long time, his little body floated up to the surface of the ocean. A tiny crumb of dirt was clutched in his paw. Thus, it was the muskrat, the earth diver, who brought from the bottom of the ocean the soil from which the earth was to grow. The woman took the fine clot of dirt and pressed it in the middle of the great turtle's back. Then the woman began to walk in a circle around it, moving in the direction that the sun goes. The earth began to grow. When the earth was big enough, she planted the roots that she had clutched in her fingers when she fell from the sky world, and the plants began to grow. After a while, the woman's time came, and she delivered a daughter. The woman and her daughter kept walking in a circle around the earth, so that the earth and the plants would continue to grow. They lived on the plants and the roots that they gathered. The first people were the sky people. They lived beyond the sky because there was no earth beneath. One day a chief's daughter became very ill and no one was able to provide a cure for her sickness. By the way, this is the second story of the same idea. A wise elder was consulted and he told them to dig up a tree and lay the girl beside the hole that remained. The sky people respected the elder and began to dig up the tree. Suddenly, the tree fell down through the hole and dragged the chief's daughter with it. As the girl fell, she saw that below was only an ocean of water. Two swans were alarmed by the girl falling and decided that she was too beautiful to let drown, so they swam to catch her. They landed her on the back of the great turtle, and all of the animals of the earth gathered there. The great turtle counsels that the sky woman is a symbol of good fortune. He ordered the animals to find where is the skyworld tree, where the skyworld tree had landed in the ocean, and to bring it back with its earth-covered roots. The swans led the animals to a place where the tree had fallen into the ocean. First, otter, then muskrat, and then beaver dove in search of the tree. Each animal came back to the surface without the tree and died from exhaustion. Many other animals also tried, but they also died. An elder woman, Toad, then volunteered. She dove and remained below for a very long time. All of the animals thought she had been lost. But finally, at last, she surfaced, and before dying, managed to spit out a mouthful of dirt onto the back of the great turtle. This earth was magical and contained the power of growth. The island grew and grew until it was large enough for Sky Woman to live on. The two swans set the woman upon the island and circled it, encouraging it to grow into the world island it is today. Yet the world was dark. Again, the great turtle called for the animals to gather. They decided to put a great light in the sky. A little turtle volunteered and climbed up into the sky with the help of the other animals' magic. Little turtle climbed into the black cloud and crawled around the sky, collecting the lightning as he went. She made a big bright ball from all of the lightning and threw it into the sky. Then she collected more for the smaller ball, which she also threw into the sky. The first ball became the sun. The second ball became the moon. Then the great turtle commanded the burrowing animals to make holes in the corner of the sky so that the sun and the moon could go down through one and climb up in the other. The Sky Woman lived on the island on top of the great turtle's back. She gave birth to twins, one good and one evil. From the breast of Sky Woman grows 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So, when this fellow told me this original turtle story, I said, I don't understand. What do you mean Turtle Island? And if you look at my picture of this turtle, I'm on my side. But this is Alaska. This is the northern part of Canada. Here is Newfoundland. The bottom foot is Florida, Mexico, and Baja California. So they called it Turtle Island. Okay. I have one more story, and then I think we'll try and take some questions. Okay? Where's Huey? Back there. All right. This is a recent story from the West Coast Nation people, the Haida Gwaii. And there's a famous image, sculpture that you could see if you go to Canada, and especially in Vancouver, at the Anthropology Museum. There's a great sculpture of a raven, which is a large crow, sitting on top of a clamshell. And inside the clamshell are all of these people trying to look and hide, sometimes hide and sometimes look out from the inside of the clamshell. And the creation story starts, and then I'll move into the story about the first people of the Haida. Long ago, no divisions existed between humans, animals, and spirits. All things of the earth, sky, and water were connected, and all beings could pass freely between them. The raven was a trickster, full of supernatural power. He stole the sun from his grandfather and made the moon and the stars from it. The raven created lakes, rivers, and filled the lands with trees. He divided the night and the day. He pulled the tides into a rhythm. He filled the streams with fresh water, scattering the eggs of salmon and trout, and placed animals in the forests. The first human was hiding in a great clamshell, and Raven released them onto the beaches. Raven disappeared and took with him the power of the spirit world to communicate and connect with humans. And here's the story of Raven and the first man. A great flood, which had covered the earth for so long, had at last receded, and the sand of the Haida Gwaii lay dry. Raven walked along the sand, his ears and his eyes alert for any unusual sight or sound to break the monotony. A flash of white caught his eye, and there, right at his feet, half buried in the sand, was a gigantic clamshell. He looked more closely and saw that the shell was full of little creatures, cowering in terror in his enormous shadow. He leaned in his great head close, and with his smooth, trickster tongue, he coaxed, cajoled, and coerced them to come out to play in his wonderful shiny world. And these little dwellers were the original Haidas, the original humans. So, we're about half an hour into our session, And these are the first three creation stories that I wanted to talk about. If we have some questions, that's great. I've got a lot more material here to talk about, so I might be able to answer some more questions for you about that. But I wanted to give you at least a flavor and a feeling for what some of the creation stories were about Canada. Dr. Shin, do you have any questions so far?
We are supposed to give our questions on a paper already.
Okay.
But in the meantime,
yeah.
Do you have any stories about interaction between the first North Americans you mentioned and Americans from European?
Yes, the European connection. Okay, so this is basically part one. The first interactions between the First Nations people and European people was in about 1000 AD. About 1000 years ago, the first Europeans came from Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Iceland, from the Scandinavian countries, and came to North America. There isn't a lot of information about that. The majority of the information comes from later on, when the first quote-unquote Europeans came to Canada. So that was in the mid and early 1500s, and the late 1400s was John Cabot, who came from England to the eastern part of Canada, and Jacques Cartier, who was from France, who came a few years later to the to the eastern part of Canada. And then about 200 years later, on the west coast, was James Cook. And he had been traveling through Asia, in fact, Japan, Hawaii, and eventually landed on the west coast of Canada. You may or may not know that originally the relations between the Europeans and the First Nations people was quite good. However, there's been a lot of stories about how that relationship was not particularly positive, particularly in examples of Jacques Cartier, who took a few members from the Iroquois tribe back to Europe with him in order to prove that he had been to North America. The other problem was that the First Nations people, their population was estimated to be around 2 million at the time of the first interaction with the Europeans. However, because the Europeans brought new diseases, that was a huge problem for the First Nations people. Measles, smallpox, and rubella killed about 90% of some of the populations of the First Nations people during that time. Furthermore, as we saw earlier in the presentation, it was very important that the First Nations people were connected closely to the earth. They were very closely connected to the earth and really wanted to try and use the environment to the best that they could. So one of the main animals that they used in the central part of Canada was the bison. You might think of the bison as the buffalo. Many people think of bison as buffalo. It's a big, looks like a cow, kind of a combination between a cow and a deer. Very strong, huge head. And the bison was used completely. They ate all the meat as well as using the other parts of the animal completely. For example, they would use the skin that had hair for clothing or for covering their shelters. They would use the skin that had no hair to make soft clothing, moccasins, more shelter styles, and baby blankets. The bladder of the animal they would use as a water container. The brains and the liver they would crush up and make this goo and then make that into a waterproof covering for some of their other implements and instruments. The ribs they would use for a sleigh in the snow, or for some children's toys. The tail to get the fly, and all other parts of the animal were used, including the dung as fire, fuel for the fire. It's dry. When it's dry, it doesn't smell. It's like similar to wood. So that was an important part of their culture. But then another aspect of the Europeans coming and interacting with the Canadian First Nations was they brought new methods of killing the bison, particularly the gun. And as a result of bringing new technology to the First Nations people, they started killing the bison more readily and more easily. And as a result, they didn't use as much of the animal, and the populations of the bison eventually came very, very low, which also caused problems. What year was it? In the 17 and 1800s, many thousands of First Nations people starved to death because of some of these added problems. So that's the beginning answer to your question, Dr. Shin.
Okay, so I think first of all, let's give Riann a very big round of applause for